So we're going to be running through, and there's going to be a lot of experiential exercises. So let's go to the next slide. The objectives are, let's see. So while Britt's getting that up to slide 2, generally objective, I give you some overall education about traumatization and adversity in the body. So we're going to do a little bit of chatting about neurobiology, a little chatting about the nervous system. I do want to hear from folks if this feels really new. If it doesn't, if it feels like you've gotten a lot of support around this, a lot of information about this, you know it like the back of your hand, do let me know, because I have a lot of slides here and I can easily pick and choose what's going to be best for the group that's here. So do chime in. I do want to talk about ACEs. It's a pretty well-known study at this point, but it's also going to be helping give us a context to why these tools are going to really work. We're going to talk about the various theories of trauma and neurobiology, physiology, as I said, and some other things that I think are going to help place these tools in context, including the biopsychosocial models of trauma. So my interest is really that intersection of the mental, the psychology, and the body and the physiology. So that's my expertise, that's my interest, and that's also been something that's helped me, I would say, survive my career so far. So I've done it, so I can speak to that as well. So could you please go to the next slide? I'm not used to asking anyone to roll my slides for me, so I'm sitting with the discomfort, y'all. So the next slide is just, actually let's go to slide 5. So we're going to go right through into a little bit of self-care. We have 90 minutes reserved. Is that right, Britt? Awesome. So this is a short amount of time to take in this concept, but y'all are busy, so we're going to make it really efficient. Do know that because we're talking about trauma in the body, you may have responses that you're not used to when we talk about this. I am going to give you lecture, but this is also a bottom-up lecture, which means that you might have a trigger, or you might have an encounter for yourself as we're doing the lecture here. So first of all, please honor that. If you need to step away, if you need to take a break, if you need to do self-care while we talk about this material, please take care of yourself. I honor and respect what you need for your body and trust that you know what you need. So take care of yourself. And also be kind. If something happens and you get activated, understands that that's because we're talking about the body and the body speaks. And so even when we talk about the subject of the body and the nervous system, it's already going to be resonating in your systems, and that's just how it works. So if we could go to slide 5. The other guidelines I'd love to just invite you into is staying present. So that means, just actively listening, mindfulness, your willingness to engage is going to really help you take in the information. Do let us know if you've got questions, something's coming up for you. Be curious, practice self-awareness. Try not to judge yourself. This is, for some of you, this is going to be material and some of you it will be new material. So come into it with some openness, and I believe you will get something from this. And this whole material here is a chance to practice skills for self-regulating. So if you find yourself, multitasking, as I've already seen that some of you are needing to do, just first honor that you've taken some time just to take in some information that may be helpful. So good for you. And also just honor that you might need to practice skills along the way, and see if you can give yourself a couple of moments just to practice in the here and now. Even if you can only give like 10% of your attention, you might find that actually that is enough to actually get a benefit from some of these exercises. So like I said, this is a lot of experiential activities in this presentation, and we've got our first one already. Some of these are going to be things that you'll go, oh, I really like that. They're going to stay with you. So take note of that. And you can go back to the slides and reference it later and build a practice toolkit for yourself. And some of them you're just not going to resonate with, but I do encourage you to, try to practice with me here. And of course, it's an opt-in, so you get to choose if you want to do this or not. So this first exercise is a guided mindfulness experiential. So we're going to just take care of ourselves. You can do or don't do depending on what feels right for you right now. But you're going to try to stay in the present moment during this exploration by what I'm going to be calling orienting. So we'll talk a lot about that today. So with wherever you are in this moment, and I'm going to practice alongside you, look around the room and notice the perimeter of the room. So what we're looking for is the boundary actually of the room that you're in. So let your eyes just kind of explore the room. A lot of these exercises, I call them sneaky because you can do them and you still look like you're not having to take time out and practice. You can do it incognito while you're at work. That's what I like. I like practical things that don't make me have to do more effort. So notice that you can still do what you're doing right now and just look at the perimeter of where you're at. And I saw that some of you are outside. So if you're outside, just notice, is there a perimeter of the street or perimeter of your backyard or wherever you are? So just notice the container. And notice now your immediate surroundings and your place in the room, where you're actually located in the room or the place you are. So notice that you're not, in another place, you're where you are. Notice your location. If you're seated, notice your seat. Can you let your seat hold you, or are you holding yourself up? Can you let yourself be held by the seat, by the floor underneath you, maybe just 1% more, letting in that support. And you're just going to check in with curiosity. You're just observing. Oftentimes when we begin to go into the body, we notice these interesting things that are happening, like, wow, I didn't realize I was holding all this tension, just trying to hold myself up. But I actually have a seat underneath me that I can let help me a little bit right now. And then just stay curious to see if anything has shifted, even from when we started this exercise. And if your eyes are closed, you can bring them to open and just look back around the room to come back into this present moment. So just encourage you to use the chat if you like and just note what you notice. There's no right or wrong. So this is just a really quick experiential to come into the here and now. And I like to do this also in seminars where we can't really see each other, but it kind of calls us all into ourselves in a different way so we can be really here with our bodies. Okay, can you move on to the next slide? I got a lot of pictures, so we're going to be moving through pretty fast. So we're going to jump into defining trauma next. And next slide. Bessel van der Kolk, which is a pretty common name these days, household name for studying trauma and trauma in the body. Body Keeps the Score is one of his more well-known books. So this says trauma is fundamentally a disturbance in the ability to be in the here and now. So as trauma survivors, oftentimes we'll find ourselves in the future thinking about what's going to happen, worrying about what's next, or in the past, remembering things, negative things often, or things that have happened to us that give us a negative bias to what we worry about happening. And that's really different because in the moment, there's actually none of those things are relevant. They are true. They might have deep relevancy in terms of the complex identity we have, but it actually in terms of the physiological impact, the physiology lives in the present. Our body lives in the present. So as we come into ourselves in this moment, that future and the past starts to move away. And next slide. As we're looking at defining trauma, I really like to bring in the definitions by survivors themselves. One person says, despite desperate to rest, my soul battles through the night. Sleep is exhausting. Another person says, the edges of me have wounds that attract more wounds. I need to grow thorns. So if you yourself have experienced trauma, you can go to the next slide, or you know somebody who has, or you witnessed it, you might be starting to really think about how you understand trauma. So we just lost the slide, so I'm just gonna give us a minute here. But I'm wondering right off the bat if anything's resonating with any folks around trauma, and how you define trauma. We lost it. I can do a whole seminar without without slides, I promise you. So
sorry guys, it's sorry, working on it.
So where the definitions of trauma are actually going in terms of how the field researches it and understands it is looking more like the impact. Because events are subjective. I have worked with trauma survivors who have like a history of chronic emotional abuse. And I've worked with survivors that have had repeated car accidents. And one folk can have a totally different kind of resiliency factor than the other folk. And then they have different life outcomes as a result of those complex scenarios. So we're looking less at the events. We're acknowledging that the events have an impact, but we're starting to understand trauma as how it actually is impacting us. And that's really where we're beginning to change some of how we're understanding and defining it. Can you move on to the next slide? So redefining trauma as an experience of when we felt overwhelmed. That sounds pretty broad, doesn't it? But what does overwhelm mean? It means that we aren't able to function. We're not able to stay in the present moment. We're more vulnerable to a whole cascade of negative experiences internally and externally. Next slide. Yes, Christina adds trauma is very individualized. Exactly. Redefining trauma by its impact or traumatization. Next slide. Understanding trauma by recognizing that many behaviors and responses are ways of adapting and coping with traumatic experiences. So part of being a trauma-informed care worker is I really do hold that the philosophy of adaptation. I do believe that people are doing the best that they can with what they have. And so that means that we're looking at like behaviors, for instance, as ways that folks have coped with a whole host of traumatization. And that goes back to the comment about it being individualized. Some folks have different resiliencies. They have had different histories. They have different generational factors that have given them a different capacity or resources to be able to cope. And so we believe that the adaptation is the person's best, their best possibility of surviving. And what we look at in trauma work is helping folks move from a place where they're surviving as if the trauma is still happening to a place where they can live a meaningful life. And that, of course, is also very individual. Next slide. I'll let you read these definitions later, but the one that I really wanted to point out quickly is that there's a disruption in self-regulatory functions. So if somebody has a event trauma, for instance, it's common for me to see folks in my private practice who will have childhood trauma, high functioning folks, but then all of a sudden they have a major event, something terrible like a shooting, mass shooting. I see a lot of folks who've survived that, and then all the trauma from the early days, early childhood just erupts. So they've been able to cope and adapt until that their system became overwhelmed, too overwhelmed to be able to function. And so we see a change in the ability to self-regulate. Maybe they were able to self-regulate through some really terrible chronic trauma at an early age, and they develop as an adult, they find other strategies, but then something really severe or a car accident or maybe a loss or a medical issue, and then all of a sudden the way that they're coping and able to take care of themselves does change. So let's go on and talk about how this intersects with us. Let's move on to the next slide. So personally, I know that these are defined differently: vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. It's said that burnout is different from those because it doesn't involve a response to trauma. But we live in a very traumatized world. This is a traumatized place. All of you, I'm sure, here, I'm preaching to the choir. There's systemic trauma with the pandemic. There is an incredible amount of trauma in the system. And I'm talking about the country organizationally, and then, of course, in our family and communities and our individual self. So it's getting a little hard to kind of go, which is which, right? It all feels a little global, which is why I think these tools that look at the nervous system are really important, because it's unlikely that any of us have been free from being exposed, witnessed, um, heard a patient report that had a deep impact on us, because we are human and we have our own histories, and they get mingled up. That's just part of being, I believe, part of being alive with other humans on this planet. But then what do we do? Because we need to be able to take care of ourselves, and we need to be able to feel like we are able to do our jobs and also be able to take care of our families and our own selves. So what do we do with all this intermingling, and who is the most vulnerable to this kind of intermingling of trauma? So, whether we are dealing with trauma in any environment, there's a high likelihood of being impacted right at this stage. So let's go on to the next slide. And I say that just to kind of put that out there on the outset, because this idea that some folks are impacted and some aren't, it starts to get a little confusing. Some people have more resiliency and resources that might help a little bit, but all of us at this stage are vulnerable. There are some things that we can look at that might give us a clue to being, a little bit more vulnerable, but things like prior traumatic experiences, things that, if you, certainly the other day, I got a call from a potentially new client, and their parent is going through bone cancer, and they wanted some support on how to take care of themselves through that. Well, my dad is too. That's not a good client for me right now. I feel like I can really stay centered and also stay present, because I can stay centered and not be present. I can go check out, but that's not actually going to be good for me, because at the end of the day, that's going to come back and kick me in the butt. It's going to all come back as a tidal wave. So I want to avoid that. So I need to, some vulnerability factors, if you can, if you have the opportunity to make some different choices around settings that are going to be better for your nervous system, do that. And sometimes you just learn on the job too. It's like, oh, I didn't know that was going to have an impact for me. Let's see if I can use some tools or if I need to make a shift. Social isolation. So that's going to be a vulnerability factor, because we know that community does help. And this is why I'm really attracted actually to this organization. It just seems like there's a lot of emphasis on building community and creating a place of support for everybody. I've heard that 4 or 5 times from Britt already today. And so it's just like, if that's available, that's going to be a protective factor, right? That turns it from a vulnerability to a protective factor. Things like being newer or having less supervision support, having less people you can go to on the job. Things like not having a supportive work environment for being able to discuss it, or not a process to discuss it. It's like, oh, we don't talk about that here. And sometimes, it's important just to kind of compartmentalize just to get through the day. But if there's no place that you can really be able to speak to what's really going on for you, it can be also add to further isolation. So these are some vulnerability things. Also just having difficulty expressing your feelings. If you're kind of somebody, and I've been there too, where you just bottle it up, it's going to be harder. You may be having some more vulnerability to vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. Okay, next slide. So, I feel like I'm probably, the folks that are in attendance here probably have some reason that you'd like to be here. But you also may not know just how prevalent trauma is. Some of these things are pretty outdated, but I will say, look, the study's from 1995. So 90% in 1995 of public mental health clients have been exposed to trauma, right? So we would just guess that it's about 100% now, right? Or close. The general population, 61% of men, 51% of women reported exposure. There's a high stigma for men to be able to come to the table and say, this happened to me. I'm also vulnerable. And so there's still some of that. And then children are really, unfortunately, still dying as a result of trauma. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to pass through this, but let's go to the next slide. You can check out the prevalence data if you like, but it's just underlining my point that we are all exposed. We are all exposed to adversity, and some of us more than others. This is a resourcing image for me. So if you're noticing yourself kind of fidgeting, if you're having some responses in your body, that's okay. I look at this and I see the strength of the legs, and I see the flight. And so if you need to get up and move, please do that. If you need to just move your spine or shift your body, let yourself do that. Okay, let's move on to that next slide. And the next one. Okay, so anybody in the chat want to let me know if they are familiar with the ACEs study? And I'm just going to see what's going on in the chat. Elizabeth said, trauma is unique to the individual. In my experience, I believe acknowledging that we all have some is inherent in connecting with other humans. Yes, I love that. That's right. I'm totally with you, Elizabeth. Acknowledgement, yes, and inherent in connecting. That's beautiful. So I'm in good company here, it looks like. So ACEs study, we're going to go through this briefly. I do have a link to the questionnaire. I would suggest you take it. In longer presentations, we'd be doing a lot of debriefing around this. But this is a really short intro, and I want to have more time for our practices and tools. Next slide. Let me pull something up on my end. I don't have access to my notes on my slide with this presentation format, so give me a moment. Okay, so I'm going to just tell. I think it's a little bit more interesting. So journey with me to San Diego, California in 1980 to where the paradigm shift started. Dr. Felitti was in charge of a very successful weight loss clinic. Through their research and methods, they had incredible results. Men and women would lose weight and keep it off as long as they were participating in the program. Next slide. Over the course of 5 years, he picked up on a disturbing trend. Despite the program being effective in helping people reach their goals, many people were abruptly leaving the program. What confounded him even more is that most of the people that left were actually at the goal weight or losing weight when they left the program. The question is, why would people leave a program that was doing what it was designed to do? Where actually they're at their weight goal and then left. Dr. Felitti, in his curiosity, decided to interview as many of these people who left the program as he could. He interviewed about 200 participants, and in one women's story, he came across something completely unexpected. What he learned from this woman was that she came into the program at 400 pounds, and through working in the program got down to about 130, and then one day just disappeared. Several weeks later, she comes back to the program and regained almost, after having regained almost 40 pounds just in a few weeks. So when she was interviewed, she shared that she had returned to work at that 130-pound weight, and a coworker sexually harassed her. This unexpected and undesired solicitation triggered a powerful and deeply buried memory of her grandfather repeatedly sexually abusing her when she was a child. It was during this period of abuse that she began the pattern of binge eating. What she noticed is as she gained weight from binge eating, she became less and less noticed by her grandfather. Mind you, this happened when she was a child. This early patterning of protection, remember I talked about adaptive strategies, was in place from an early age. She subconsciously developed this self-protection strategy so that other predators like her coworker, she could go unnoticed and feel safe. So she lost her way, her original way of staying safe in the world. So stunned by this, Dr. Filidi went back to his team and got a study together to find out what the lives of his clients were like in childhood, because he believed it could be a reason why they left the program. So they went on to find in this small case study control of about 300 people that almost 60% of people had a history of abuse, and that sexual abuse was particularly common. The key takeaway for him and his team was that what they saw or perceived to be the problem, which in this case was obesity, was in fact the solution for his patients. But a solution to a problem that was not obesity, but a different problem that may have happened to them decades earlier. Their solution was a defense mechanism or maladaptive survival skill, and one that had severe and significant health and mental health consequences. These findings led him to ask the question, what other significant events do we endure or encounter in childhood that can inform our health behaviors and health in the future when we are adults? So these questions were brought together by what we now call the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE for short. We can go to the next slide. Actually, we can go down one more from there. So in brief, they surveyed 1,700 adults on childhood trauma and adversity. It spanned over 10 categories: abuse, neglect, and household stress. You can see how it's defined in the slide. And then they followed patients for about 10 years. So it was a cohort longitudinal study, which is what made it so impressive. And 18 states since have done the ACE studies, because this was actually done by, I think, Kaiser Permanente employees, which were mostly like middle-aged white men and some women. So it wasn't like a really good segment of the general population. So it's been interesting to see that it's been done in many different populations, many different states, and the results are pretty consistent with the original study. In some cases, we're seeing just higher ACE scores, of course. So let's go on to the next slide. So these are the main takeaways that I'd like you to have. ACEs are common. Prior to this study, there's an idea that problems in the household were caused, especially in healthcare, problems were caused not by problems in the household. The study clarified that trauma is universal. So it also said that 2 out of every 3 people, about 64%, had at least 1 or more ACE score on the ACEs, and only a third, or 36%, had a childhood that was free of any of these events. Wow, right? So let's go on to the next slide. The reason that I believe this has gotten so much attention, because if you're talking about psychological trauma back in the 80s, I don't think that was very interesting to anybody back then, maybe just select healthcare providers. But now the ACEs were able to show a correlation between, an association between negative health outcomes and behavior outcomes and higher scores. So that's very important. Things like behavior outcomes like substance use disorders, smoking, heavy drinking, mental health problems like depression, anxiety, history, suicide attempts, self-harm, and eating disorders. Also found that ACEs are associated with chronic diseases like COPD, type 2 diabetes, non-skin type cancers, and adult onset heart disease. Even stroke and obesity have been implicated as well. So we're seeing like there's just so much data to show this intersection. And I think it really did help wake up the healthcare community like, wow, you know, there are some things that we do need to pay attention in terms of how people were, what their early history looks like, and how that has downstream effects for their mental health and behavioral health and physical health. Next slide. So they're also associated with poor social outcomes. And then one more slide next. You can see here that dark blue is one ACE, a score is 1 on the ACEs score, and then you can see gray is 4 or more. And so this is a really interesting scale to see the relationship between ACEs of 4 and more and some of these well-known health issues that I'm sure a lot of you are involved in caring for. Next slide. Okay, so we're just laying the groundwork, almost through this big piece here, but maybe we go to the next slide actually. I just wanted to point out that there's a loop between the top being the tree here of abuse, parental separation, mental illness, incarceration, substance abuse, and neglect, which is what the ACEs study looked at in its questionnaire. And all the stuff that's in the roots, that's in the soil, things like COVID now, slavery, collective histories that are traumatic, community violence, poverty, racism, mass incarceration, these are all in a feedback loop. So it's like it feeds these questions that were being asked. So we do have some work to do in terms of really understanding the gravity, the width, the breadth of the childhood experiences and how they're related to just more than what's happening in the 4 walls of the home, right? So this is an important thing to note. Next slide. This again is just a really important graph to understand the gravity of childhood experiences that were adverse and how we can see that it relates to early death. So I do encourage you to take the score, to do the test. The link is in a prior slide, and just see, you know, what it's like for you, and just have some reflections on your own experience. I think it's important to validate our own experiences, especially as we're working with folks who likely have high scores themselves. Next slide. I'm going to just move through this really quickly. Next slide is, how does this happen? Why does this happen? So what's important to know is that there's a lot of factors in how these scores get high, but one of them to know, and we're heading into neurobiology in a moment here, but that health brain development is experience dependent. That means that in the first 2 years of life, there's dramatic proliferation in the neural network, followed by a period of pruning thereafter. So what are the behaviors and experiences that are being cultivated in the environment, and how that does also shape the brain and turn on various genetic experiences. And next slide. We love talking about this in the field of psychology because it's like, well, that sucks, right? But also there's change that can happen because the brain, as we know, has flexibility. We know that we can change the brain. And what we're going to be learning today are all things that will change your physiology and change your brain. So I can attest to this also as a trauma survivor, that I've had just a lot of success in brain change and behavior change work through bottom-up approaches. So it's not a sentence. Let's go down to the next slide. The reason I bring up toxic stress is because we have to think about the amygdala. It stimulates toxic stress stimulates and dysregulates the activity of the amygdala, and it's the headquarters of managing stress and threat. And it plays a significant role in regulating our nervous system and HPA axis. So with activation, it can dysregulate our immune system, which can lead to a cascade of chronic inflammation, right? And so toxic stress can have really, really terrible. This is the relationship to why we believe that some of the higher ACEs scores are associated with health effects. This image it's a Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry is an incredible researcher on stress. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is related to his early research. But this is a really stunning image, right? So we just talked about neural pruning and the environments, and this is the difference between when there's an environment of extreme neglect. So we can see the image on the right is a very different 3-year-old brain than maybe someone who's had a typical life. And extreme neglect is like starving the plant. You know, this is having terrible effects on brain growth and, of course, all the entire system itself. So let's move down a couple more slides. We're going to shift from ACEs. I'll just take a quick pause to see if there's any questions. Maybe we can just, yeah, ACEs are a risk factor, not a guarantee. So I hope that got registered. Let's take let's go down to the next slide. It's such a beautiful image. So let's take a minute actually and shift from this heavy lecture on the ACEs. I know I'm going through it quickly. And let's take a few moments here, maybe just a minute or two, and let's change up the pacing. So we're going to do a walking mindfulness meditation. Some of you will have the ability to do this and some of you won't. So if you have the space to do a walk, even if it's in your room, I'll do that. I'm going to give you some instruction. And if you don't, you can try that first activity again of just looking in your periphery and then feeling your chair or your feet and just noticing that. So here's the instructions for walking meditation. And we'll take maybe 3 minutes, and I'll kind of ring a bell or let you know to come back. But if you're practicing walking, what you're going to do is just choose something to focus on as you're walking around. It could be the floor. It could be your feeling of your feet on the floor. Could be maybe the movement of your ankle joint or your knee joint. I like focusing on joints in mindfulness meditation. It's really potent. You could feel, where does your foot strike the ground? This is a non-judgmental activity. There's no right way to walk here. You need to walk slow enough in this practice so that you can pay attention to what you're noticing. If you walk too fast, it's hard to observe subtleties. So walk slow enough that you can pay attention, but not so slow that it feels kind of strange and unusual. So find a slow down pace and just take a walk. And we're going to come back in just a minute or two. So have a few moments to yourself. I'll pause here and I'll let you know when to come back. And then just coming back in the next minute or so, finding your way back to your seat, your place in the room, wherever you are. And before you come back into paying attention too much to this presentation, just notice what's happening in your body. If there's been any shifts, if you've come into contact with any new awareness, if you feel maybe your inner rhythm has changed. I was, some of you may know about Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a teacher of mindfulness. He recently passed, but I've been through a few of his programs at his monasteries, and there it's pretty much a silent retreat, and then you come into cohorts to chat, which is like such a relief after all day silence. But I was with a healthcare group, and I'll never forget this. This nurse had been working in the a New York hospital, I think for 25, maybe 30 years, a long time in the same place. And she said that when she first learned mindfulness meditation, it was about 12 years ago. And then she had no time in her day. So she started practicing it walking from one place to the next. And she was like, it was weird because everyone was like, what, why are you walking so slow? That's not the speed, right? It's not, any of us who've worked in these environments know there's a speed. It's like a stream, and you don't slow down from that. But there she was, day after day. Every time she showed up, she'd at least do it once a day. And she said that it took about 2 years, 3 years, but then people would start joining her and they started walking with her. And then people would just know her as the woman who does the mindfulness walking. And then more folks would join. So in their to and from, they would take that 2, 3 minutes, which is all it actually takes sometimes just to shift your internal state, shift your physiology. And so I imagined that there was a cultural change on that floor because you've got just these people who are participating in group community mindfulness. Very, very bottom up, right? Very organic, not a grassroots, right? Okay, so just something to think about. We're gonna actually go right down into the nervous system stuff. There's some info back there that is on. So we'll go to slide 55. 55, yeah, great. So there's some information on the triune brain theory, but I think this is where we really want to get to today is talking about the nervous system. So forgive me for sharing things that some of you already know. I do know that you're all very knowledgeable about the perhaps like the central nervous system here, but this is what we're going to be talking about is the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, and particularly today, what I'll call the gas is the sympathetic nervous system, and the brake, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. The reason this is relevant is because we have found that through some techniques, we can impact, we can change our nervous system. So here's the orientation to it and how it gets caught up with trauma and what happens with traumatization. So brief overview, the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, not one's good or bad, but they come together to maintain a homeostasis in the system. We know that the sympathetic system, the gas, changes, it increases the breath rate, the blood pressure, the heart rate, pupil dilation, sweating, and stress hormones, and it decreases digestion and saliva. So if you're feeling like, you've got a boss who's, changing your schedule and it's not a good schedule, you start to feel a little dry in your mouth, right? Maybe you have you're not hungry anymore for your lunch. So there's things that happen as a result of taking in information in the world, and the system is just trying to respond. It's like, that's a threat. So this threat, we got to do something about this. So we're going to oppress that gas. So this is automatic, right? And then there's the parasympathetic brake, which is that rest and digest. It decreases the breath rate, heart rate, blood pressure, pupil constriction, and sweating, as well as increases the saliva and digestion. So, if you're somebody, I know this is really hard probably in a lot of your practices, but if you don't feel like eating for your lunch, it's probably because your sympathetic system's pretty primed up, like it needs to be usually for work. And so you do need a little bit of just parasympathetic tone to get your digestive system ready to take in that food and make use of it as energy. So just a couple of breaths can really help you be able to take that food in. So gas and break, gas and break. That's how it goes. Next slide. This is a quick chart of, it's not automated right now, but if it were, you'd see that the charge, there's an energy and a rise of the sympathetic system and a discharge and a decrease down for as the parasympathetic system comes on. And this charge and discharge is like, you can think of it as a wave that if we have a self-regulatory capacity, if we've never been impacted by adversity, this thing would just kind of do its thing, right? And you'd have your system, it would be in homeostasis all the time. And sometimes that does happen for us, maybe in a safe home environment around the folks we love. There's some really nice regulation that's already happening for us. Next slide. When there's an event, let's go to the next slide. Looks like it's just not in its, it can go up. Yeah, thanks. It looks like it's not running the kind of automated function. But you can see here that, let's just call that traumatic event, like, I don't know, getting cut off on the highway. So somebody comes into your lane, you're kind of just listening to your favorite song, you're feeling great, and then somebody comes in and you have a little bit of sympathetic tone because you're driving. You need to be able to be responsive. But then someone cuts you off, and that's really alarming to your system. So sympathetic system recruits in order to be able to react. It's very important, right? It's that place of fight, flight, or freeze. It's going to come in and say, what do we need to do here to survive? You're going to get a spike in sympathetic tone, which means you're probably going to start sweating. Your heart rate might go up. Those kinds of things we just listed is a normal way of ramping up the system for mobilization for survival. So are we going to need to do something? And do we need to get out of the way, which is a flight? You need to do something else? Again, all running automatically in the background. Oftentimes, if we've got a pretty healthy system, it's going to go into some regulation. So we start to go, oh, okay, that driver just passed and I'm still gripping the steering wheel. So there's some sympathetic charge there. And we just begin to let it go. And overall, the system might come back into some kind of groovy regulatory state. But if you have a history of trauma, you've got high ACEs, you've got maybe other kinds of physiological dysregulation due to life events, work events, what have you, may be more susceptible to what we call getting stuck on or getting stuck on off. So by now, I'm hoping that some of you are like, yep, that's me. Yep, that's my pattern. So stuck on might look like this. So that's on the sympathetic side of things, right? So I'm driving along, get cut off, and then I start to come down, but I'm like, but why did they do that? I mean, how dare they? Let me go after them. I'm going to just show them, right? So you're chasing the car. Your system's stuck, right? You're like, no, I'm going to stay up here. Or it's just, you're unable to settle. It just feels like you keep replaying the person cutting you off. You feel a little bit more irritable. You're snappy with your friend who just called. Ways that your system can get stuck. And same thing on the parasympathetic side. So let's just say you come down feeling better, but some of us then go into dissociation, if you've heard of that word, or we go away from ourselves. We feel more tired. We feel a bit more numbed out, or we seek to do that. We seek to numb ourselves out. So those are some things that what happens when the nervous system gets stuck, and it's not our fault that it gets stuck. We just have some patterns in our nervous system that predispose us to getting stuck. It still means you can come back into regulating your nervous system, but it's good to know your pattern. And also here, what you should notice is that what goes up always comes down. And so if you've been hanging out on high, stuck on, it's going to come down. You're going to have a big crash. You might feel tired. If you've got things like chronic inflammation or pain, you're going to feel more pain. Things are going to start to rebalance in the system, but in a really probably a bit more dramatic way. So what we try to do preventatively is have good nervous system health, good self-regulation practices, so we can prevent some of these places where we can get stuck. Next slide. So I totally cut out the polyvagal slides. I'm happy to talk more about that offline. But just so you know that there are few ways to regulate the system, and one of them is going to be through the ventral vagal, which is your social response, social engagement. And that's why what Elizabeth said about inherent in connecting with other humans was so right on for the science as well, because when we come into that connection, even if it's eye contact, in some kind of more first responder social work, events that I might be involved in, what I do is I ask my team. I said, "Listen, I'd like to have us be able to, if you can offer it, let's make eye contact throughout the day." Because what's that doing is it's actually providing nervous system regulation. It's actually turning that dial down. It's supporting the sympathetic system and coming into a balance through the ventral vagal response. So it's nice if you can find ways to, and that's why calling a friend can feel really helpful during your lunch break or whatever you're doing. But there's ways to take care of your nervous system through social engagement. We're going to go down a couple of slides. There is a slide above called Mindfulness Break. I just want to note it. It's a beautiful breathing practice. If we have time at the end of this course, I'm going to have us go through that. But we've got some other really good stuff to get to. Let's go down one more slide. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about proprioception and intraception, because this is really the science of embodiment. And where we get into our body and how we get into our body gives us access to the nervous system. So this idea of regulating our nervous system can't be possible without becoming more aware of ourselves and our body. So proprioception is the body awareness sense. It tells us where our body parts are without having to look for them. So for example, you can try this right now. You can close your eyes. And if you're in a space to do that, please try that. And then just with maybe your index finger, touch your tip of your nose. So if you found your nose, that means you've got, that proprioceptive sense is working, which I'm pretty sure it is for everybody. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to make it here. But it's also good that this stuff goes unconscious. Otherwise, something like trying to figure out if all of the proprioception that we needed to move throughout the world was conscious, like of our present mind, then we couldn't drive, right? It would be too many things. So this stuff has gone, when we were a baby, it was like all novel, like, oh, this is so fascinating, so amazing. And then over time, as that develops, as proprioception sense develops, it goes into that subconscious, unconscious place where we just reference it when we need it, like, ow, what happened? But most of it is unconscious. And part of this work of getting healthy in this model is to become more conscious of some of these things to help us get better access to ourselves. Intraception is how your body feels inside. So I've already asked you a couple of questions, but noticing what's happening inside. So this is sort of things like I feel less hot, I feel more cold, I feel less tense. We might be able to even sense things like respiration and our heartbeat. So there's functions inside the body that we're tracking. Let's go down 2 sides. Always hot. Yeah, me too. Me too. It's might be a little bit of a sympathetic tone business. I don't know. So it's important because it prevents body awareness, right? So we've got a lot of proprioception developed in the front side of our body, but not so much in the back. That's why there's more back injuries. We can't see our back, we see our front body. So we have more connection here. So it's really important to listen to the body because it gives us those early warning signs. It also helps us have our boundaries and space. I mean, it's oftentimes that if we haven't have a good sense of our boundary body, our sense of connection to our body, someone might come into our space and we have overridden that and we don't really pay attention to that. And later we feel stressed. We don't know why. So these kind of give us a sense of like, okay, I think that's too close, or, I need to shift myself in the room. A lot of my clients um, they've learned that they like to sit in different parts of the room that give them better access to things like the door. So, I mean, if you can sit in a room and look at the door in the waiting room, and that's going to help your patient, your client feel more at ease, why not? But that's going to give them information on how to already settle their nervous system. Okay, so let's go down a couple slides through somatic experiencing. So this is where this is going to get really fun for you guys. So I can't load up the videos right now, but if we go to slide 71, I can tell you a little bit about this model. This is a model for resolving stress in the system. And this is what I'm going to be teaching you some basic tools in today. So you're going to leave with a couple of these. So what this is based on is Peter Levine, who's the founder. He took this from a lot of different places. So I think I call him like he generated the information and put it all together, but it's not this information has been out there for a while. He studied animal models and he noticed that animal models, he wondered, like, why don't animals carry stress with them? They seem to have very serious survival issues on a regular basis, but they don't have chronic diseases like we have. They don't have issues like we have as human beings. So, why is that? And what he learned is through the threat response cycle that as a human being, we often have disruptions. If there were no disruptions in the cycle, we would be doing things like, discharging the energy through all sorts of practices. Like if you have a pet, like dogs are a good one. I remember working on this one unit, and a nurse, I was working on a adolescent self-injury unit once, and this nurse, everybody loved her because she also brought her dog, this Chihuahua. The Chihuahua would be there for 12 hours. By the end of the shift, that Chihuahua was shaking because it got pet so much, right? So everybody was petting this Chihuahua, but the Chihuahua was trying to release the energy from its nervous system by shaking. And that's what dogs do. They shake, they snort, they buck, just like deer, just like all other animals, mammals. They have some way of discharging the allostatic load of the stress. If you haven't been able to, and a lot of us humans also, it's not socially appropriate to do the fight or the flight response. Some of us might feel like, oh, I got to get out of this meeting. That's what my body wants to do. But there's going to be negative consequences if you run out of the room. So your body might be saying, I want to run away, but you do an override because we live in a social society where there's rules. So it's kind of like this interesting thing that the body has these responses all day long that don't get attended to. And this theory is about how all of that gets stuck in the system and then begins to dysregulate the nervous system and the physiology. Does that make sense? So just quickly looking at this, you can see that there's exploratory orienting, there's arrest and startle. So it's like let's just call it like a deer in the woods. And so it's kind of looking around and then it's eating. So it's in a pretty good parasympathetic place. But then it doesn't have that sympathetic system running on high like some of us all the time. It only comes on when it's needed. So then there's a twig that snaps and it goes into alert, right? It goes into startle. It's going to move its ears to identify the orienting, finding the sound. It's going to let its nostrils open and close to flare and get in as much sensory data of smell it can. Its skin is going to try to perceive what's happening in the environment. So all these things go into orienting to find out, is this dangerous or not to my system, to my body? And then if it is, it's going to not choose what should I do, fight or flight or freeze. It's going to go into an automatic response. So let's just say its nervous system, its physiology, its neurobiology, its whole system says, Oh yeah, that doesn't sound right. That's really close to me and it sounds big. So it goes into flight, deer do that as a common response. And at some point, it's going to reorient. Is it gone? Is that threat gone? And let's just say, in this case, the deer outran its predator. What it does next is it's going to buck, it's going to shake, it's going to snort for like a couple of seconds, and then it's going to go right back into the ability to eat a meal in its parasympathetic tone. So our system doesn't cycle that fast because we have all sorts of other things happening, some of which is trauma and trauma histories, and some of it, of course, is social response. All right, so let's head on down to, yeah, so how do I know I'm regulated? Let's go to the next slide. So these are some thoughts I'd love to hear from folks who are attending, but when my nervous system is balanced, my activation is low, I feel things like open, curious, available for connection, relaxed, yet alert. I react appropriately, so I'm not overreactive or underreactive, shut down, able to be present, competent, and I feel healthy. I feel like things are manageable. I have choices and options. I recognize when I'm moving out of my functional range, and I know how to reach out for support. Yeah, hopeful, Britt adds. That's right. Next one. Next slide. Okay, so these are some steps you can take a look at, but I'm going to show you some tools now, and we're going to go through a couple of them. All right. So the first one is felt sense. That's on slide 77. So this is being able to access the body, again, through intraception and proprioception. And the reason we want to do felt sense and be able to have a tool around this is when we're able to see what's happening in our body, we can be able to assess our system better and we can make better changes to our system. So if I'm just doing mindfulness or a skill or self-care tool, but it's kind of staying up in my head, it's not going to have a subcortical and a cortical change. It's not going to have a brain change as significantly. So again, I'll go back to the bath idea for a minute. If I take a bath because I'm supposed to, and someone said, well, that's how you do self-care. I go into the bath, I'm doing it from up here in my intellectual space. And then I get out and I'm like, yeah, I guess that helped. If I take the bath and then afterwards I watch what's happening inside my body, I might notice things like I'm more relaxed, or my breath rate has changed, or I felt more peace. And we don't really have to go into all the judgments as why that is, but now my system is registering it and I'm connecting my experience to my felt sense, and that's where brain change happens. So let's try this out. Can you go to the next slide, please? So let's practice. So let's take a moment and just notice how you feel overall inside. Just notice. Do you feel heavy? Do you feel tired? Do you feel open, soft, tense, contracted, cool, hot? And then take your hand and squeeze or tap some part of your body. Could be your hand or your arm, anything that feels comfortable for you. So do something that you like to do. I like to squeeze my thighs. That feels pretty relaxing. And then after you do that for just a moment or two, just notice what's happening again in your body. Go back inside, just with curiosity, and see, what did you notice? What do you feel? And then just notice anything else. And if you want to put it in the chat, you can. But so that's a really quick experience of what's happening inside and just noticing what's happening with your felt sense. And so you did something to change your physiology, your body, by giving it some input with the squeezing or tapping. And then you noticed what happened after you did that. So maybe some of you experienced a change in your tension level, for instance, or a change in your attention. You felt more calm in your brain, or you felt more active. So, without any judgment, there is maybe some things that have changed. And what's interesting about noticing the felt sense is if you track it, it always changes. It never stays the same. So, a lot of people fear that, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to notice. I mean, when I first did this work, I was like, why would I go inside? That's where all the pain and the unhappiness is. And I went in, and what I found is if I just stay with it, it changes. Our sensations are always changing. It's our mind that puts a identification with that. Oh yeah, I feel that, so it must be this, and this is why. And then the next thing we know, it's bigger than it was before. And sometimes we do need to examine what's happening for us. But if we want to be able to go inside and be able to change our physiology, our felt sense experience, oftentimes what we need to do is just stay with it a little bit and it will change. Let's go down to the next slide. If you had some trouble with like identifying sensations, this is a great slide to come back to. Gives you a lot of language. If you felt like I've never really thought about this before, you're not alone. We a lot of us in our country just don't get education on the felt sense language. So feel free to take a look at that. So the next thing, building on, these all build on each other, is orienting. We've already done this. That's great. Thank you. So this is engaging with the environment. Why is this important? One, what it does is it helps bring us into the present moment. When we are doing something, let's just say we're working and something just happened, let's just say there was some sort of event that happened that was pretty unsettling. Oftentimes it's really important so we get back to work. And so what we can do though is go into the felt sense and notice, how am I really doing? And maybe we feel a little bit of shakiness, we feel a little bit of charge or activation in our body, in our system, our nervous system. And what can help right away is orienting. So that's like what the deer did, because the body says, uh-oh, there's something still happening in here. But often we try to talk ourselves out of that, like, no, it's not. It's not happening anymore. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, right? So, what is really important is to orient, because your body needs to take in information from the here and now. So, go to the next slide and I'll show you what I mean. So, what you're doing is like the deer, is you're taking information as raw data. It's your sensory system goes right into the central nervous system. So you're not going into perception, like looking around the room and going, I like that picture. I don't like that picture. It's just letting your system get into the orienting field is going to give it information about the here and now. And it's going to go, oh, that thing that my body's running on right now, that response isn't happening anymore. And often that's going to really help to downshift you and regulate your nervous system. Let's try it. So let's move down a couple of slides, see if there's anything here. I do want just to point out that if you could go to slide 86, there's a lot of sensory data you can get from your environment. I'm going to suggest we use eyes to start because it's pretty dominant for most folks, but you can use your ears, you can use your nose, taste, any sensory system, party sensory system will be helpful here. So let's practice together. So just coming back into wherever you're sitting, what that means is just becoming aware of where you're standing or sitting, or where you are right now. And then if you're going to use your eyes, just let your eyes look where they want to go. Just look where they want to go. So they might start to wander, and that's okay. When we aren't dictating where the organ goes, the eyes themselves, they start to look. They look for novelty, they look for pleasant things, for neutral things in the environment. And it actually can feel even relaxing just to let the eyes look where they want to go. I can't tell you how many folks room, they're like, I have to look at this person's eyes. I'm like, that's not normal. Let your eyes look where they want to look. And then you'll see their respiratory system change. Like, oh, whoa, I didn't realize, right? So let your eyes have the freedom and choice to look. What do they become aware of? And maybe find something right now, just as a more of an advanced experience, is look for something neutral or pleasant in your environment. And if you don't have any of that, you might look at Brit's environment because she's got a beautiful office. I was like, look at those hats. She's got a bag. I mean, it's beautiful. Or my environment, if you see our camera. So you can just look and see what your eyes find interesting, beautiful, or neutral. Neutral is fine too. Sometimes pleasant is not available. Then please take a look at what's happening inside you as your eyes connect with that image. Just see what begins to happen. And just notice what other shifts you have. So sometimes you could do this a couple of times. One time might be enough as you learn to practice this. So what was the sequence was you're going to come into connection with yourself, go take a look, let your eyes wander where they want to go, find something neutral or pleasant, and then notice what happens inside in your felt sense. Yeah. So I'm just curious if folks want to just share or anybody has any thoughts about what happened for them, what changed in your felt sense, what did you notice? I'll tell you what I happened for me as you're deciding if you want to pop into chat or not. I know some of you can't do that from where you're sitting. So what happened for me is my eyes found something in the environment. I'm in this environment all the time, but because I'm using my organ, my sensory system, not my perception, it found something that looked novel to my sensory system. And it's this beautiful light shadow casting from a lamp. And I took that in, and my chest felt like it widened. And I noticed my breath rate slow down, and I noticed my body weight, and I felt more here. So that's what happened to me. So all of that is possible in 30 seconds or less as you get more experienced with this. I do this all day long, all day long. And what I find again and again for myself, and I do this with mental health, social workers, counselors all the time, they find that it begins to shift how they feel by the end of the day. So by the end of the day, folks feel more present, more available for connection and the things they want to do and enjoy. And work starts to feel even better in some cases. We're not taking on as much trauma in our system. Let's scroll down a little bit. I can't really see what's there. It's quite small. So clearly I have a lot of information here. Let's go down to internal. It's like a 92, I think. 91. Yeah, stop here, 91. Can you go up one slide? And then I'm going to just stop in a moment just because there may be questions. And if not, I'm going to run to the end of the session so folks have a bit more information. But SC resourcing is there's external and internal resources. This is different than self-care. These are resources that are going to help you regulate your nervous system. So I'd encourage you all tonight to take a note of what are your external and internal resources. An internal resource is an external we kind of get. It's like, what are the safe people, the pets, the nature, the rooms, music, exercise, travel, that kind of thing. And you can do this real or imaginal. So sometimes we don't have access to that. So we go into the place of that, beautiful landscape that we remember, or trail or hiking trail. And we just see, again, use the felt sense to watch your body change. It's going to change in the moment. You're not making it change through your mind. Your physiology is actually changing. And then your internal resource is going to be something that helps you experience less constriction, having more breath, presence, or pleasure. Things like feeling more relaxed, more spacious, less tense. Like for me, having a back to my chair is actually makes all the difference in the world because I'm someone that's always driving forward, always pushing, pushing. So I've had to learn how to receive the chair. Receiving the chair for me means just having myself notice the back of my chair, and that helps me feel more relaxed. So these little things can actually give you some resourcing that you can use throughout your workday and even at home. Okay, I'm just going to say one quick thing about pendulation. Can you go to 97, please? Believe it or not, this was a I eliminated over 100 slides. So I'm used to doing this in about 3 hours. And so my internal clock is a bit off. But I do want to say that a further application to this is something called pendulation. So with trauma and PTSD, usually what we do is our attention goes from the activation. Oh, I feel like my heart's racing. This terrible thing happened. Um, or this sense of my heart racing to this terrible thing that happened in my memory, and then I go back to the heart racing, and then I go back to the memory, and that becomes that becomes a relationship, right? And then so you've got somebody who's got a propensity for feeling like they're about to have a panic attack. What they've done is they've done a lot of priming in their nervous system, understandably, because it's a relationship now. What we want to do is, and you can do this too, is take your activation and go to one of those internal or external resources or your orienting. So it's like, oh my gosh, did that just happen? I just witnessed that, or I just experienced that. My heart is feeling like it's racing. Okay, got it. And then I'm going to go to, Britt, because she's got a beautiful smile, and I know I feel safe when I take a look at her smile. And then I'm going to go back in my body. I'm going to see if it settles. If not, I do that again a couple of times. Or I go to the image of my family on my desk, right? So it's like that. Pick something, one of your internal, external resources. This is why the list is really important. So you're going to pendulate your awareness from the activation to the thing. And what happens is you don't get stuck anymore. That nervous system, remember, on or off, it's going to start to loosen what happens in your physiology, and you're going to have more flow. We don't have enough time to experience this, or enough, ability to be in the chat together. But I would love to hear about how things go for you. If you've got follow-up questions, I'm sure there's ways to reach me. We're just coming to the end, so I just wanted to see if there are any comments or questions. And do review these slides. It's just jam-packed with great stuff. And I did handpick this stuff for this community because I believe it will help, and I've seen it. So let me know. What do you have any thoughts, any questions before we wrap up? I know a lot of folks are off camera, off mic, off chat, just probably plugged in, which I appreciate you for hanging in there.
If you do think of any questions, we can always send them to Olivia, but we do have the question and answer section or the general. You can drop them there. Either or, it's fine with us. It was some great information, so I know some of us are.
I know it was a lot, so just taking it in. Yes. Yeah, so important. I agree, Elizabeth. So important to keep talking about this impact. And find ways where it's not all on us, that there's this sort of like reciprocity between our communities and our workplaces and ourselves. And I think, I really believe, and I see this all the time, is when we change our physiology, the system changes also.
Well, it looks like we're just all excited that we had this today. That's what it sounds like from what I can hear. Um, So yeah, with that, if you guys don't have anything, I just want to extend my gratitude. I pulled a card, an affirmation card for everybody today, and I just wanted to read it to you guys because it's gratitude, and I am obsessed with gratitude. So, and it goes in kind of hand in hand with the self work that we're doing. So all humans suffer, and I find this idea revolutionary and freeing because the people who I envy, admire, and idolize suffer just as I do. So I choose overwhelming gratitude for my life, for I am all that I need. So you guys are all that you need. So I just wanted to extend that to you that I hope that this was helpful for you to, just regulate your systems and your minds. I will send out all the slides. I will send out the recording. So if you missed any part of it, you can refer back to it. But we just ultimately just appreciate you all for coming today and Livia for being with us. She was amazing. I will be sending out a survey as well. So if you guys want to fill that out and just give me any tips or hints or anything that you guys want to see in the future for events like these, we have a plethora of them, but we are always open ears to just being everything that you guys can have out there. So we thank you again, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your night and day. Thank you so much.